Tonight is Gale Stokes, who was a colleague of mine from the time he joined the faculty in 1968 until his retirement in 2003, and he's a colleague beyond that. In his nearly 40 years as a Rice professor, Gale was exemplary. I mean, if you want to find out what a Rice professor ought to be, Gale Stokes was that professor. He taught a wide variety of courses and won his share of teaching awards. Served the university in a number of capacities, including 2 terms as chair of the history department and 3 years as dean of humanities. He is also a prolific scholar and earned a national reputation in European history. He was trained at the University of Indiana in Balkans history with a specialty in Serbia. And the first of his 4 authored books, and he has a major edited book, the first 2 were on Serbia. After that, there came the documentary From Stalinism to Pluralism, a documentary history of Eastern Europe since 1945. The Walls Came Tumbling Down, the Collapse of Communism in Eastern Europe. 3 Eras of Political Change in Eastern Europe, that was 1997. And in 1999, he wrote a beautiful textbook on the history of Western civilization. All these books, and there was also 70 articles and book reviews, too numerous for me to count. The book that got the widest attention and is arguably his best book is the book The Walls Came Tumbling Down. This is a remarkable book in many ways. Gale began this book in 1991. The revolutions of 1989 were scarcely over. He finished it in 2 years, which for historians is like overnight. And when that book was done, it turned out to be an extraordinary study. It is from a scholarly point of view, authoritative. It is eloquent in its prose, and what it does is tell, in compelling fashion, one of the most important stories of the 20th century, and that is the end of the Soviet Empire. Now, since the publication of that book in 1993, huge archival collections have opened up in Europe and also in the United States. Whole libraries are now filled with books on this subject. And so a few years ago, the editors of his press, Oxford University, came to Gale and asked him whether he wanted to revise it. So he spent his retirement working. He accepted the invitation, and he produced this book, the 2nd edition of The Walls Came Tumbling Down. Lots of 2nd editions just have new introductions. This is much more than that. It is a substantial revision. The first chapter is gone, 6 chapters have been substantially revised, and 3 chapters have been added. Now, if you have ever really wondered what happened to Yugoslavia after 1989, you can actually find out in this book. And that is no small achievement. So today, Gale is here to talk about that book. And it's a book which I think anybody who's interested in the subject would want to own. Fortunately for you, you're going to have that opportunity today. The book will be on sale in that room that you came through to get here, and Gale will be there to sign your copy. So I think this is a book well worth purchasing, and I suggest maybe you do that. In the meantime, Gale, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Alan. One of the things that Alan didn't mention when he was making that wonderful introduction, and I greatly appreciate it since there's very few people on the Rice campus who know more about this subject than he does, if any, actually, was that in the first edition of this book, when I wrote the first edition of this book, I needed some time. He said 2 years, but I got some grants and one thing and another. But he was Dean of Humanities at that time, and I'd like to thank him right now that he gave me 1 semester release from teaching so that I could finish up this book, and that's in part while I was able to do it in a couple of years. This edition took 2 years also, but as a retired person at a much more leisurely pace, where you come to work late, go home early, and some days you don't come at all. I was in a conversation with a well-educated, highly successful, well-informed person some time ago, a few months ago, and we got to talking about what we're doing, one thing and another, and I said that, well, what I'm doing is I'm rewriting or working on a book, and she said, well, what is the book on? And I said, 1989. Blank look, like 1989. Why would anybody write a book about So I thought maybe I would start this evening with just a couple comments on what happened in 1989. At the time, the events were stupendous. Those of you who are of the right age and remember looking at those headlines. What? The Berlin Wall fell? People are going through what? You mean to tell me that Václav Havel, the poet or whatever, playwright, has become president of Czechoslovakia just coming out of prison? This is crazy. It was stunning and stupendous, and we all thought, and I think with some justification, that this was a revolution. And it's still thought that by many that it was. The great British first-class journalist Timothy Garton-Ash has said, for example, that it was Europe's best year because it's the only time the people of the region got out on the streets and overthrew a repressive regime successfully. So he calls that Europe's best year. And of course, it very soon became apparent that the Cold War was over. The thing that for 40 years, or so, almost 40 years, had been the defining element in our foreign relations as the United States, suddenly the United States emerged as the victor, as many people thought. And then, even more spectacular, 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't collapse in civil war, bloodshed, maybe a little, but not much. It just flat out collapsed. One day, Gorbachev was on the TV resigning, and that was the end on Christmas Day, 1991. These were totally spectacular events, and that's why, like Alan said, it's one of the most important events in European history. Modern history. If you take a longer look, now we're 20 years from that, those interpretations are still there, and they still have meaning. I use the word revolution in this book, and I'll say in a minute what I mean by that, but there are a number of other things that we didn't think of at the time. For example, let's say you're in Latin America or Southeast Asia. What meaning does that have for you? Isn't this kind of a Eurocentric view that this was such a dramatic event? And there are those in the Third World who see 1989 as the end of the tag end traditional colonialism and imperialism, where the United States and Russia as entities were struggling with each other in places like Nicaragua and Southeast Asia and Angola and what have you. So that's one kind of interpretation that downplays the significance of the events and opens up some different thinking. Another one is Amartya Sen, the famous Nobel Prize-winning economist, for example, has said that what 1989 did is remove a roadblock to globalization. Perhaps the most important major phenomenon of the last 30 or 40 years is globalization. Like it or love it or hate it or whatever, it's a fact, along with the vast increase in information speed and quantity and so forth, the information revolution. And of course, for most of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and its satellites in Eastern Europe were removed from that. They tried to create their own contained Soviet or socialist economy, and they were not part of it. And so Amartya Sen has said that, well, this roadblock was removed, so you can see it as kind of a milestone in globalization. And then there's also the idea of the European Union or the European community. This, in my opinion, the European Union, is the greatest political invention of modern times in 20th and 21st century. If you look at the European Union's development from a distance, from over time, it looks pretty linear. You know, it starts with the Coal and Steel Community, Treaty of Rome in 1957, and goes up to Lisbon in 2009. It's not linear. If you start looking at it closely, it's often a mess, and it's Euroscepticism, Eurosclerotics, and so forth and so on. But actually, it's been a kind of a steady projection towards the 27 countries that are now members of the European Union. If you see that, as I do, as the most important political invention of the 20th century and 21st century, and certainly for Europe, then 1989 is kind of a milestone in that it opens the door for the European Union to continue its expansion and bringing its benefits, as I see them, to the rest of Europe. So there are other ways then of thinking about this. My way of thinking about it, as I express it in this book, at least, is that the 20th century was a century of huge, vast socio-political economic experiments on the European soil, especially on Eastern European soil. The first of these, of course, was Nazism and fascism, which came to well-deserved grief after 50 million dead in the European Civil War that went from 1914 to 1945. It came to grief and proved to be an enormous dead end. The second one is what I call pluralism, which is my term for democracy, limited government, liberal government, or things that have many names to them. But I call it pluralism, which is the principle of politics of accommodation that is part of the ethic of the European Union. That experiment was successful in that it created the European Union and an ethic of democracy throughout now almost all of Europe. So that was a second experiment. But the third one, of course, was communism. And it was not perceived as a dead end in 1945 or 1960 even, but of course it proved to be so. And so two of the great experiments of the 20th century came to grief, often because of events in Eastern Europe. And one of those is the one that 1989 is about. So how did it happen? As the Russians sometimes like to say, who's guilty, you know? Why did it happen? The great symbolic event is, of course, as the title of this book suggests, is the collapse of the Berlin Wall, or the penetration or infiltration through somehow of the Berlin Wall on the evening or night of November 9th, 10th, 1989. A totally unexpected event, even to the East European government, which didn't really intend it to happen. It just kind of happened more or less by accident and inattention and fit of absence of mind, so to speak. But what I would like to stress here for a few minutes is some of the events that preceded the collapse of the wall, because it was in Hungary and Poland that the foundations for the collapse were really laid. And I want to spend a few moments on Hungary because it's not the place you would think to focus. You might think to focus on Poland, for example, because in 1980 there, the Solidarity Labor Union movement emerged, and I'll say something about that. But I want to say a couple words about Hungary. And one of the changes that I made in my book revision here was the emphasis I placed in the first edition on what you might call the democratic opposition, the underground that was part of the Hungarian scene in the 1970s and the 1980s. First of all, I stressed the Budapest urbanists, as they were called, and they were very exciting, very intellectually interesting and so forth, and kind of ignored the populist Christian nationalist groups that were more from the provinces. And I've corrected that. So this was important. There was opposition. There were two basic camps, many subsets, but two basic camps. The Budapest intellectuals, typically from Marxist or families or backgrounds of some kind, and often Jewish, and then the populists from the countryside. And they were very important. But there's two other things that I think are probably more important, or at least equally as important as those people were. And first is in the economy of Hungary. Hungary was always noted as a place where a lot more innovation was happening. It always happened within a centrally planned framework of the Marxist system, or the communist centrally planned system. But they already, in the 1960s, for example, had permitted agricultural co-ops to go into business. At first, they go into business like selling seeds or warehousing materials or food processing, something having to do with agriculture. But by the 1980s, they had started doing other things as well, such as building computer power supplies, for example. In other words, the agriculture co-ops were pushing the envelope of becoming more like regular businesses by the 1980s. Hungary joined the IMF and the World Bank in 1982. This is quite different because it opened them in a new way to Western practices, so that by 1983, they permitted their socialist enterprises to sell bonds. And by 1985, there was a little bond market in Budapest. And they also, during the 1980s, instituted a lot of changes that are very similar to the ones Gorbachev eventually instituted in the Soviet Union under the rubric of perestroika. They always, from the 1950s, had let certain small shops like barber shop, a tiny restaurant, car repair place, and so forth, that in the Soviet Union were all under the central plan. They permitted those a small number, and in the 1980s, they permitted those to blossom, so that by a factor of 8 or 10, those small private enterprises, restaurants, and so forth. And then in the 1980s, they permitted co-ops, not agricultural, but cooperatives with fewer than 100 employees to form, and these became sort of like private enterprises. One of the most original ones was their work partnerships. If you were specialized in, let's say, architecture, you're an architect working for an industrial firm. The architects of that firm could get together and form this work partnership and sell their architectural expertise even back to the firm that nominally employed them, and then even elsewhere. And the managers liked this because this put them off of the wage, sometimes put them off of the wage accounting, and was good for their plan and so forth. But the point of it is that in these different ways, even in agriculture, where people started actually in the 80s moving to the countryside because they could start a very small feedlot or become mass producers of eggs or something like. They took, as one sociologist said, parking orbits in the countryside hoping for a better future. But you put all of these things together, it's still a socialist system. It's all parasitic on socialism, on the socialist system as it existed in Hungary. But there is a lot of entrepreneurial skill being learned by the practice of these enterprises. And the regime itself did things like we have today here, innovation fund, enterprise fund, these things that would help people become small-scale entrepreneurs. So this is very different than the rest of the communist bloc, even in Poland. And the second thing then, beside the economy, is there are reformers in the government. There are reformers in the party that had been there all along and had had some influence in putting in some kind of socialist economic reforms, but by the 1980s, they started to exert some influence. For example, in 1985, they had an election in Hungary in which opposition or non-communist individuals could stand for election. So there'd be multiple candidates in some precincts. And some of those were elected. And in fact, when that parliament came in 1985-86, it was probably had more opposition or independent, let's call them, independent candidates than, say, Mexico did. In fact, one of the amusing things is when somebody cast a no vote in the Hungarian parliament in the mid-1980s, they actually didn't know how to count it because there'd never been a no vote. They had to figure out a method of getting the no vote, get the no vote in. And their leader for 25 years or more, 30 years, János Kádár, became senile. And by 1988, he was gone. And instead of being replaced by the old-fashioned people like Erich Honecker in Germany, for example, or Ceausescu in Romania, he was replaced eventually by reformers. And so in 1988, they had a new law on association, which meant people could associate for political reasons. Then just like flowers popping out of the ground in spring, all kinds of people started making little associations, which became eventually, some of them, political parties. They were very concerned about, some of them were very concerned about Hungarians in other parts of Europe, especially in Romania. This led them, without going into detail here, to be concerned with the refugee issues and to adopt the international protocols on refugees, which led them then to decide, well, maybe we should open our borders. And in March 1989, this is, of course, well before the great events even in Poland or in East Germany and elsewhere, in March 1985, they informed Gorbachev, we are going to take down our border defenses with Austria and some other places. And now, what would have, first of all, they would never have said such a thing to Stalin. But if they had had the nerve to say such a thing to Stalin, what do you think would happen? That would be the end of them. And what did Gorbachev? Gorbachev said, well, we're starting to loosen up a little on our borders also. I mean, he didn't react. And in May, they started cutting the barbed wire. And if you recall those events of that year, this led to East Germans saying, oh my gosh, we can get over to Austria through Hungary. So they started coming over to Hungary and sneaking, and sometimes not even sneaking, sort of the guards would look this way and the East Germans would run over to Austria that way on their way to West Germany, where they automatically became citizens. So this was all internal Hungarian actions. And they decided then, okay, we need to think in a new way about how to work. And in June 1989, they got together in a round table with the party, the unions, the church, the oppositionists that I spoke of, and other social elements in a round table discussion. And by September, they'd reached an agreement. It was no longer going to be called the People's Republic of Hungary, but just the Republic of Hungary. The leading role of the Communist Party was no longer part of the Constitution. So well before the Berlin Wall collapsed, there was what you might call a revolution in Hungary. Let me just say a couple of words about Poland, because there the Solidarity movement was earlier than those events, came in 1980, the creation of an independent union. Why was this such a big deal, solidarity? It has to do with the basic Leninist ideology in 1903. Of course, the communists represent the working class. Marx said the working class, the proletariat, will eventually rule, and after the revolution, and Lenin agreed. But he said in a famous pamphlet in 1903 called What is to be Done? Burning Questions of Our Movement. He said, well, yes, of course, the proletariat is going to rule, but the problem with the ordinary worker and proletariat is you can buy them off. You give them higher wages, better working conditions, shorter hours, better pension, and so forth, and they will be co-opted into the capitalist system. And forget about the revolution. We can't have that, because they don't understand what we, the communists, Bolsheviks, Leninists, understand, that the revolution is the most important thing. And we understand history. It is the only possible way to think about how to rule the world, and therefore we will be the vanguard of the proletariat. And of course, then the vanguard of the vanguard is the leadership of the party. Eventually, the vanguard of the vanguard of the vanguard becomes Stalin at the very top. the only rational man in the entire society. And so to have an independent union in which the party is not the leading element in society, though that phrase or a phrase like it was in the constitution of these socialist regimes, that the party always has to be the leading element, and they are opposed to anything spontaneous. But an independent union is really a spontaneous event. But for various reasons, the regime in Poland in 1980 was constrained to accept Solidarity as an independent union. Of course, by 1981, the new leadership, or the leadership at that time, headed by General Jaruzelski, decided they couldn't take that any longer, and they put it down by introducing martial law in 1980. And so from 1981, December 1981, so from December 1981 till 1989, there is a very interesting back and forth between Solidarity, the myth of Solidarity, the actuality of an underground, representing eventually what they call society, the people. There were 10 million members of the Solidarity Union when it was actually existing, on the one side, and the regime, the state, the government on the other, who had the power. That is, they had the military, they had the troops, they had the police and so forth, but society, represented by Solidarity on the other side, had the sympathy of the people. And there are many other elements involved here. Of course, there's the church with Jean-Paul, Karol Wojtyła, elected Pope in 1978, I think, 77, 78. And his visits to Poland electrified the Polish people and gave them an alternative way of thinking than socialism, and there are many other factors. But by 1988, when a whole group of strikes broke out, again, the regime, Jaruzelski's regime, decided that we have to deal with this. And one of the great things about Wałęsa, who proved not to be Lech Wałęsa, the leader of Solidarity, who proved eventually not to be that great a leader, but in this circumstances, as the head of the Solidarity movement, he had the great advantage, or the great insight, I should say, to know when was the right time to strike a deal. And he believed in 1989, when he was offered a deal, that yes, we have to take it. He had much opposition from people in his party and his group and the people around him, but he managed to get together with the state, the regime, the communists, in a roundtable discussion, and this eventually led to the election of June 4th, in which the communists were utterly, utterly defeated. In fact, some of the leaders of the party who went into the election unopposed were defeated. This is a Polish election, right? Unopposed, but you're defeated. How is that? Because you get a ballot, with one name on it, but you could cross the name off. And so many people in many precincts crossed off the name of the communist candidate that that candidate didn't get 50% and lost the election, even though they were unopposed. And this led to the creation, it's very interesting actually, real politics returns to Poland, and by September 1989, before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Poland had a new Solidarity-run government, which very quickly took control, introduced what's known as shock therapy, and Poland has done fairly well, more or less, ever since. Well, I stress these things, spending quite a bit of time on them, because I want to emphasize one of the main points of this book, which is, if you ask who's responsible for the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, many Americans will say, well, Ronald Reagan is, because, well, he called Soviet empire the evil empire. He introduced Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which overburdened, allegedly, the Soviets. And he gave that famous speech in West Berlin, situated photogenically right by the Berlin Wall, in which he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And it came down, and therefore he's responsible. Well, I really do not intend to denigrate Ronald Reagan. In fact, he understood Gorbachev better than most of the people around him who remained vintage Cold Warriors, some of them like Dick Cheney to this very day. But he understood Gorbachev. Alan Manasow has studied this, and he says that Gorbachev and Reagan, I should say, Reagan became an interlocutor, as Alan calls him, of Gorbachev, and had an influence on Gorbachev's internal politics and so forth. He actually did understand, but he had nothing to do with what happened in Hungary, what happened in Poland, and in fact what happened when the Berlin Wall collapsed in November. It's the people, and I want to emphasize the elites often, that permitted this to happen. Now in Poland today, the whole round table and solidarity deal that led to the election, that led to a solidarity government, is extremely controversial. People on the far right have been opposed to that ever since before, in the late 80s, and they still are opposed to it, that solidarity and the leftists and so forth capitulated to the communists. And there are people on the left that say we shouldn't have done it. And it's very controversial in Poland today. But I think it's important, at least for my understanding of what happened there, that it's not just the people who got out on the streets. Yes, they are absolutely fundamental to the collapse of communism, and especially in a place like Romania or in Czechoslovakia. But in Hungary and Poland, the elites of the Communist Party did decide to have their roundtable. They did decide to work out a deal. Maybe they made some political mistakes. That deal didn't work out for them. But it's the elites also. So it is the people and elites of Eastern Europe, not the great powers, not Margaret Thatcher, not Mitterrand or Reagan or George H.W. Bush, who did that. And I think that's important to know and important to remember, just for a little humility that we often don't show as our ability to influence events as a great power. If you follow the events in the so-called Arab Spring, came kind of as a surprise to everybody. You can remember by current events that you can see by current events that we can't always do what we want to do when we want to do it. Some people think we can. I think this suggests that even small countries, at the right historical moment, under the right circumstances, can have an enormous impact on outcomes that affect us and the rest of the world. There's another widely held view that the USSR collapsed for economic reasons, overburdened by the military expenses that Star Wars was going to impose on them. Yes, it's quite true that the Soviet Union had a difficult economy. In fact, I'm going to read something from Gorbachev. It sounds like it comes from Robert Gates, head of the CIA, or somebody like that. But here's what Gorbachev said in 1987. He said that the country in the 1970s, this is Gorbachev, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting directly, that his country, Soviet Union, started to lose momentum. He said, because of declining efficiency, excessive use of energy and raw materials, waste of capital, poor consumer products, a wage-leveling mentality, lack of long-range planning, inability to attack important social needs such as housing, unproductive agriculture, and a decline of the moral values that grew from a reliance on propaganda of success rather than honest accomplishment. This is Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, not some neocon in the West, some Western economist of some kind. However, as János Kornoy, the famous Hungarian economist, said one time, an economy that is neither efficient nor optimal may still be viable. And everybody in the Soviet Union knew they had problems, but in 1985, 86, they believed that somehow we can muddle through. They didn't know how, just like I think a lot of economists don't know how we're going to muddle through today, but nobody thought the Soviet economy was going to collapse. Certainly Gorbachev didn't. But it did for, I think, the actions that Gorbachev took to fix the economy actually destroyed it. Perestroika was his famous, it was called restructuring of the Soviet economy, and it went by the name of Perestroika. He said, and he introduced in 1986 or 7, I forget which year there, a law on individual economic activity. That meant that this is very much like Hungary. Small shops could now, restaurants could act independently. In 1987, there was a law on state enterprises in which control over the enterprise was devolved from the center to the managers. 1987. 1988, there was a law on cooperatives, much like the law in Hungary, which actually became essentially private enterprise. Now, this was supposed to help fix the economy by introducing some sort of autonomy market, something or other. But of course, the Soviet Union did not have a court system set up for this. They did not understand that you had to have a banking system, that you had to enforce contracts, that there was no business law, and so forth. So that all of those structures that exist that we don't think about very much in the West did not exist. You need a strong governmental structure to provide those things, enforcement of contracts, stable currency, banking system, and a whole slew of other things, for capitalism to actually work, and they didn't have them in the Soviet Union. So what those reforms actually did is open the door for the aggressive, venal, entrepreneurial types who were members of the Communist Party as well and had good connections to entrepreneurs to do what is known as rent seeking. That is, to turn the assets of the state, that's the only body who had assets in the Soviet system was the state, to turn those state assets in their particular sphere into private assets. And we have then the collapse of the Soviet economy and the emergence of these so-called oligarchs and people providing their own security. You don't call on the police, you get your friends and associates that you knew from the old days from the KGB, and they form a security company, and they provide you with these tough-looking guys with guns, and they shoot people for you. I mean, really, it was a serious collapse. Here's another question. How come Gorbachev didn't use force? People ask that question from time to time. He's the leader of the Soviet Union. They have 370,000 troops in East Germany, for example. They have troops in Hungary in 1988. They start to leave in 1989, but they have troops there. Why didn't he use force? Certainly somebody like, say, Andropov, who preceded Gorbachev as General Secretary General, probably would have used force. There's two reasons for this. First of all is what I call the history of declining force in the Soviet Union. 1945, here comes the Red Army raping, shooting, destroying right through Eastern Europe. The next time something big happened, 1953 in East Germany, then in 1956 in Hungary, they sent in troops shooting, and there was serious bloodshed and fighting. But in 1968, with this famous Prague Spring, the socialism of the human face that was being introduced in Czechoslovakia at the time, they didn't send in shooting troops. The Red Army itself didn't actually come in. They had their allies, the NATO, the Warsaw Pact armies occupied, and there was no shooting. Then in 1981, when Jaruzelski in Poland put martial law down, Jaruzelski put martial law in December 1981 and put down solidarity, he was very nervous that this wouldn't work, and he explicitly asked the Politburo, if I need you, can you send troops to help? And the Politburo explicitly answered, no, we won't. Then at the same time, in part maybe one of the reasons was that they had gotten involved in Afghanistan, which became a running bloody sore, and they decided in 87 to get out. They finally got out, I think 88, 89. If people like Andropov and Suslov and Gromyko and these very conservative guys in 1981 would not use force to help Poland in a quasi-military operation of imposing military law by force, who is going to do it in 1989 after their Afghanistan experience? So that's one thing. There is a history of declining force. The other is that Gorbachev's personality himself. I haven't spoken much about Gorbachev, and I'm not going to. I just keep mentioning his name. He came in 1985 and started a whole new thinking in the Soviet Union. But he was not a bloodthirsty type. He had an idea eventually for the creation of a common European home, which he actually, I think Reagan kind of got this, that he really believed in, that it would be possible for two social systems, capitalism and socialism, communism, to live in harmony with different systems, okay, but not to be fighting each other all the time, because after all, we have a common European experience here. And he hoped to be able to create some method of doing this, doing away with NATO and the Warsaw Pact and some other kind of fuzzy way of dealing with things. And he believed in that, and he did not believe in force. Force was used rarely in the Soviet Union, maybe in Baku, Tbilisi, maybe in the Baltic states, but never with his approval, and he always rejected the use of force when it was used. Whatever else the Russians may think, and they hate Gorbachev because today, most Russians, because the Soviet Union collapsed and he was responsible. But whatever else you might say about Gorbachev, when he left office in December 1991, he did not have any blood on his hands, and that was not a small accomplishment, in my opinion. Okay, I want to say then, in conclusion, only one other thing, and that is, I think there's some relevance to what happened in Eastern Europe, or at least some of the ideology behind the collapse, to what's happening in the Arab Spring these days. One of the fundamental ingredients, I think, of the modern ethic around the world is the basic role played in modern politics by the desire for dignity. That is, the desire to feel that you are recognized in some way as an authentic, valued individual. This is a modern concept, probably grows out of ideas of popular sovereignty and equality and equity from the French Revolution. And during the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of East Europeans who wrote about how to live in truth. How can we have some hope for a good future in what is obviously, after the invasion of Brezhnev's invasion of 1968 in Poland, how can we have some hope for a good future in what is obviously a hopeless situation? And the answer was, as they put it, to live in truth. Live as if you were free. Not too many people did this because it meant you probably went to jail, but that was the idea. And here's a couple things that Václav Havel said about this. First, in a letter to Husak, who was the president or head of Czechoslovakia in 1975, Havel said, even if people never speak of it, they have a very acute appreciation of the price they have paid for outward peace and quiet, the permanent humiliation of their human dignity. And then in 1978, in his great essay, well worth reading, I think one of the great political essays of the 20th century, Power of the Powerless, he said, under the orderly surface of the life of lies, there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, the singular, explosive, incalculable political power of living within the truth resides in the fact that living in the truth has an ally, invisible to be sure, but omnipresent. This hidden sphere, the hidden sphere he's speaking of the desire for dignity. Anything that touches this sphere concretely will inevitably speak to people. And it did speak to people in Eastern Europe in 1989. They didn't get out on the street, even though some of them were under economic stress. They didn't get out in the street and yell Deutschmark, Volkswagen, and whatever. They got out on the street and yelled democracy, freedom, those kinds of ideas. And that's the same that's happening the same thing happened in the spring in the Arab countries. They were not out on the street, as we might have thought, seeking Islam or some other thing that we might have thought. They wanted to get rid of a regime that was imposing upon their freedom and on their personal dignity. And this is even true of the Solidarity movement. The Solidarity program, this was not written by an individual, but by a group and they adopted their program in the fall of 1980, said this: "History has taught us that there is no bread without freedom. What we had in mind by establishing solidarity, what we had in mind was not only bread, butter, and sausage, which they wanted, but justice, democracy, truth, legality, human dignity, freedom of convictions, and the repair of the republic." I find that pretty inspiring, actually. And that's what they wanted. And so I say this has significance in the modern world, and I would think that we should somehow acknowledge that and pay attention to it. Well, we don't have time. There's many things in this book, far too many details, unless you're fascinated by some aspect of it. But I don't have time to talk about how Eastern Europe has done since 1989, although there are several chapters in this book about that, except to say that they've done pretty well. Different places have different countries. Each country is different, of course, and have had their ups and downs, problems of corruption, and so forth. But they have all, maybe one or two exceptions, they have all had peaceful governmental changes. The elections are peaceful and pretty fair. They have small radical movements on the right, but no more than, say, England or France does. And the chapter that I took out of the first edition of this book, because it was only covered to 1990 and 91 or something like that, was I called "The First 2 Years of a Long Time," which suggested that I thought it was not only was it going to take a long time for real democracy and pluralism to come there, but that it would happen, and I still believe that. Thanks. What question? Go ahead. Yeah, question. I mean, we have a few minutes before the massive lines before the book sale. So anybody have something in particular you'd like to talk about? Yeah.
Would you say a few words about Yugoslavia?
It's very hard to say a few words about Yugoslavia, because it collapsed, of course, in 1991, 1992. The former Yugoslavia now consists, there are 7 independent countries. Each of them is different. Slovenia was the most successful. They successfully re-identified themselves as not a Balkan country, but a Central European country, and got into the European Union and used the euro and have been pretty successful. Croatia is about to join. They have their treaty now, and they probably approve it in December, and once the laborious process of approval by the other 27 countries happens, they'll probably come in 2013. But, I mean, today we don't speak of Yugoslavia, we speak of the Western Balkans, which includes Albania. Albania is a basket case. I mean, so is Bosnia. Who knows what will happen there? We have a newly independent country, Kosovo, which remains as it was in the 1980s, an area of great controversy and conflict between Serbia and Kosovo. We have a country, Macedonia, who is just being prevented from progress by the what I consider the remarkably stupid policy of Greece over the name. Greece will not permit Macedonia to join the European Union. NATO blockades their streets and so forth because they adopted the name the Republic of Macedonia. And Greece say, well, Macedonia is ours. You can't have that name because it implies that you want our Macedonia, which is totally absurd, but it's a passionate issue in Greece. So Macedonia and Greece are at odds. And so it goes. I mean, there was a vicious war there, which I believe was caused sort of on purpose by Slobodan Milosevic, who was the leader in Serbia, and Franjo Tuđman, who was the leader in Croatia, who purposely brought up to the surface passions that exist and did exist but had been slipping slowly below the surface. They purposely brought them up for their own short-term gain, and it resulted in passions that could not be eventually controlled. I think the main guilty party here is Slobodan Milosevic. You know, every society has its men between the ages of 15 and 30. If you look at violent crime, murders, overwhelming majority of those crimes are committed by men between 15 and, well, 30, 35. Every society has them. And we have them. But we live in a fairly stable situation in which the passions of those young men are contained. Slobodan Milosevic said to those, that some portion of those young, the most violent subset of those young men, said, oh, it's perfectly all right to organize yourselves in groups and we'll help you arm, in fact, if you go kill Turks, as they call them, or Muslims in Bosnia. And it was, there are many, well, I got off on a tangent here, but I think Milosevic bears most of the blame for what happened, but so does Tudjman and many other sub-actors that let things fly out of control. As the West has some, Europe, United States, has some responsibility too. Nobody wanted to deal with it. It was too messy. Nobody knew what to do, and who wants to get involved? And it wasn't until 1995, after you know, a couple million refugees and a couple 100,000 deaths and so forth, that finally we intervened and stopped it. But I don't know. It's a huge subject, and I can't talk much more about it right now. So yes, Jerry.
When you said that the European community was the great political invention of the 20th century,
Yeah.
what coming in second and third? I mean, what's the kind of context?
No, there is no second and third.
No?
At least it is such an innovative moment. If you go back to, say, the time of Charlemagne, okay, 800 AD, from time of Charlemagne until Hitler died in 1945, you can't find 70 years or 60 years now of peace in Europe, where there are not all kinds of disruptions and wars. Now, it not only has there been peace in Europe, not counting Yugoslavia, which is not part of the Union, but you can't find such a peaceful era in European history. And so many things have changed. The idea now is cooperation. For example, Bismarck in 1870 did what he called, waved a red flag in front of the Gallic bull. In other words, he purposely tried to irritate the French, and they automatically responded, and you have a Franco-German war. Well, you can't do that anymore. No, you can't do that. What happens is people go to these negotiating venues all over Europe, and they're constantly negotiating this, that, and the other thing, and complaining and instituting this, that, and the other policy. But there is a shared, now as the European Union developed, they became linked together by thousands, hundreds of thousands of little linkages on what bottled water should be like, and what the weight of trucks should be, how many wheels there should, and how big the wheels on a truck should. I mean, you know, all of these kinds of things. So that today, Europe is linked together in peaceful means. And they have also gotten strong on human rights and all democracy and all of these kinds of things. So that today, it's very difficult to imagine a political situation in which some kind of war is going to break out among European powers. Yes, those controversies, but they all rush off to Geneva and with their cell phones and try and figure it out. You know?
Gale, what is the status of Romania today?
Romania, there is a difference between the Central European countries, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, and Poland, and the Southeast European ones, Romania and Bulgaria. One of the good things that's happened in Romania is Romania's always been noted as an anti-Semitic place, 19th century and into modern times. But as they were trying to join the European Union, they realized that this no longer flew very well with the rest of Europe. You know, it was not as good an idea. And their president, in 2004, something like that, actually gave a talk in which he agreed that the Romanians had arbitrarily killed a lot of Jews, that this was very bad. They rejected this historical idea, rejected the notion of anti-Semitism, and began various institutes and public things like teaching the Holocaust in Romanian schools. And they instituted these policies in part, not because the leader, Iliescu, was somehow converted. He probably personally, as an individual, wasn't. But under pressure to get in the European Union, they did that. And now they have several institutes. You have to teach the Holocaust in schools and so forth. So this doesn't mean that all Romanians are now cured of their anti-Semitism, doubtless not. But it's vastly different than the 19th century and the 1920s and the 1930s in Romania, and there's real progress there. Economically, both they and Bulgaria are at a different level than the rest of Eastern Europe. There's a lot more corruption. They came from a worse spot. The regime in Romania under Ceausescu was by far the most oppressive regime in Europe. By far, not even close. And you know, once the fabric of society is destroyed, it's not easy to rebuild it. And it has not been easy in Romania. It's been a little easier in Bulgaria, but still very difficult. And they lag behind especially in their legal system, and in various other ways. They were brought into the European Union separately from the other places because they were it was realized about the time of 1998, 1999, it was realized probably by the rest of the European Union, it's probably better to get them in the tent than have them outside the tent. But a little nose holding went on when that happened. It's very difficult. It's easy to be critical, but just think, in the United States we had a revolution in 1776. We didn't start to deal with slavery until 1860, and we didn't really start to deal with the consequences of that until 1960s. You know, so it takes a while. It's from a dead start. Yes.
Considering your enthusiasm for the European Union, are you concerned about the current problems in the currency amongst?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And what that could do to derail the biggest achievement of the 21st century? Yes,
I mean, you know, I'm always afraid that if I say all these positive things about the European Union, I'll pick up my paper tomorrow, you know, and I think they could. I don't hope this doesn't happen, but they could abandon the currency. They can't do this right away, but let's say somehow this was possible. There are still 80,000 pages of the acquis communautaire, what they're called, that the accomplishments of the community that are legal, the law in all 27 of these countries. They don't go away. They're still there, and I seriously doubt that the European Union can collapse. It's had very difficult times in the past. In the 60s, for example, they had the empty chair problem when de Gaulle didn't come. You know, they only had 6 members at that time, but de Gaulle didn't come, and they had their meetings, and there's the empty chair where France was supposed to be. And they've had a lot of often serious problems. Somebody wouldn't approve something, and then there's chaos. And they would have conferences in which that had to be decided. Something had to be decided by November 1st, according to the rules. Well, it'd get to be midnight, October 31st. 31st, one day's in October? I don't know, anyway. And so they would just stop the clock at 5 minutes to 12, and everybody would stay there negotiating until 6 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock the next morning, and then they'd finally come to some kind of conclusion, and then they'd start the clock again and get it done on time. There have been a lot of crises in there, and this is a big one, a very big one. And goodness knows how they'll solve it, or if they will solve it in some comfortable way, or whether they'll just stagger along. But here's the great thing about the European Union. Whatever other problems they have had, and whatever problems they are facing right this minute, since 1945, there has been no war on the continent of Europe. Not Yugoslavia, but not France, Germany, England, Italy, Spain, no war. The previous 30 years, 50 million people were killed in World War I and World War II. I consider this a phenomenal accomplishment. Phenomenal accomplishment. Yes?
How significant was the reunification of Germany in this whole?
Yeah, I didn't mention, there's a whole section in the book here about the reunification of Germany, which was incredible surprise to everybody, including the Germans, that this happened, despite the fact that Margaret Thatcher was adamantly against it, and so forth. But Helmut Kohl was the leader here, and he decided not too long, within weeks of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that's what should happen, and he maneuvered it through. George H.W. Bush was very important in this because he kept supporting Kohl. They talked a lot. It was a remarkable diplomatic event because H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Gorbachev, Helmut Kohl, and then others on the side, Margaret Thatcher, not so much, but Francois Mitterrand and James Baker were the main players in those events. And they did, usually things are staffed to death. If you read, there's a great book, wonderful, I think it's a good book by James Mann called, what's it called? The Revolt of Ronald Reagan, or something like that. Is that the title of that book? I can't quite remember. It's something like that. He spent 100 pages telling you how that phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, got into that speech. And all the staffing on one side and another, and all the people are putting in their suggestions and wording, and should they do it? Finally, Reagan just said, I'm going to do it. And everybody said, oh, okay. But this was enormous. That's what usually happens, in government. But this time, those 3 people in particular, 4 people if you include Baker, kept negotiating among themselves, calling them, and they did very minor staffing. Bush's task was to keep Gorbachev happy as best he could, and they did it. It was by the ordinary standards of peaceful diplomacy, it happened with lightning speed. Took less than a year to reunify Germany. It's an interesting story, and there it is, right in there. Thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks, Bill.